The person you love just walked away from someone very important. And you'll be surprised to find out who it was. Don't scroll, listen to this because your heart needs this right now. Some decisions are made in crowded rooms where everyone notices. Others happen so quietly that the world keeps moving without realizing someone's entire future has just changed. Somewhere today, the person you love reached one of those silent crossroads. No arguments echoed through the air. No dramatic goodbye was spoken. No one chased after them asking them to stay. Yet one simple choice quietly ended a chapter that had shaped their life for years. They walked away from someone very important, and if you knew who that person really was, it might completely change the way you understand this moment. It wasn't simply another relationship. It wasn't just a friend, a mentor, or someone they happened to meet along the way. The person they finally walked away from had influenced nearly every decision they made, every fear they carried, and every dream they postponed. The surprising truth is that before they could fully move toward the future their heart longed for, they first had to leave behind the voice that had been convincing them they were never ready. The morning began quietly. Sunlight slipped through the curtains. The alarm rang softly. A cup of coffee cooled beside the kitchen window. Outside, neighbors greeted one another as another ordinary day unfolded. Everything appeared completely normal. Inside, however, your future soulmate felt something they hadn't experienced in a long time. Clarity. Not perfect certainty. Not complete confidence. Simply the quiet realization that continuing to live the same way was becoming more painful than choosing something new. For months they had been carrying invisible weight. Every opportunity was met with hesitation. Every hopeful thought was followed by doubt. Every dream was interrupted by one familiar question. What if I'm not enough? That question had become so familiar it almost sounded like truth. It followed them everywhere. Into conversations. Into quiet evenings. Into sleepless nights. Into every important decision. At first they believed those thoughts were protecting them from disappointment. Eventually they realized they were only protecting fear. If your future soulmate could place an invisible letter into your hands today, perhaps it would begin like this. There is someone I've finally decided to leave behind. For years I believed this person understood me better than anyone else. I listened to every warning. I believed every prediction. I accepted every limitation they placed in front of me. But today I discovered something heartbreaking. The person who has held me back the longest has never been another human being. It has been the fearful version of myself that kept whispering I wasn't ready to live the life waiting for me. They closed the notebook. Read those words once more. Then smiled gently. For the first time they understood what needed to change. Not their dreams. Not their future. Their relationship with fear. Later that morning they left home and wandered toward the familiar park that had quietly become their place of reflection. Children laughed across the playground. An elderly couple walked slowly beneath the tall oak trees. A young musician played a gentle melody near the fountain. Life continued with beautiful simplicity. Watching those ordinary moments reminded them that no one around them looked as though they had every answer. Yet people continued living. continued hoping, continued loving. Perhaps certainty had never been the requirement. Perhaps courage had always been enough. They found the wooden bench beneath the old oak tree and sat quietly. Closing their eyes, they remembered every opportunity they had abandoned because fear convinced them to wait. The phone call they never made. The conversation they postponed. The dream they quietly placed on a shelf. The chance they convinced themselves would come again someday. Each memory carried the same lesson. Fear had promised protection. Instead it had quietly stolen possibility. Perhaps you've experienced something similar. Maybe you've looked back on a season of your life and realized that your greatest obstacle wasn't another person. It wasn't bad timing. It wasn't impossible circumstances. It was the quiet voice inside that kept saying, "Not yet." Your future soulmate had finally become tired of listening to that voice. The afternoon passed peacefully. They wandered through familiar streets without any destination in mind. The breeze carried the scent of blooming flowers. Sunlight reflected from shop windows. A small cafe welcomed people escaping the warmth of the afternoon. Everything around them seemed to whisper the same gentle invitation. Keep moving forward. Eventually they stepped inside the little bookstore they had visited many times before. The owner smiled warmly. "Good to see you again." They smiled back. Something about that simple exchange reminded them how meaningful kindness could be. Walking slowly between the shelves, one book immediately caught their attention. They opened it to a random page. One sentence seemed to wait specifically for them. "The life waiting for you begins the moment you stop negotiating with fear." They remained still. Reading it again. Then once more. The words settled deeply inside their heart. Perhaps this was the person they had finally walked away from. Not someone standing outside them. Someone living inside every doubtful thought. Leaving the bookstore, they carried no book. Only a new understanding. As evening approached, golden light stretched across the streets. Returning home, they opened the notebook once again. Without hesitation they began writing. "Today I walked away from someone who has followed me for years. They looked like caution but behaved like fear. They sounded reasonable but always left me smaller than I truly was. They convinced me that waiting was wisdom and that silence was safety. Today I finally thanked that version of myself for trying to protect me, and then I let them go." The words flowed effortlessly. Each sentence felt lighter than the last. If the invisible letter continued, perhaps it would say this: "There is something I hope you understand. Walking away doesn't always mean leaving another person behind. Sometimes the bravest goodbye we ever speak is to the version of ourselves that no longer belongs in the future we're trying to build." I've spent too many years asking fear for permission to be happy. Today I stopped asking. Evening slowly became night. The first stars appeared above the rooftops. Standing beside the bedroom window, they watched the sky grow darker while something inside them quietly became brighter. Hope. Not loud hope. Not unrealistic hope. Steady hope. The kind that grows when someone finally chooses truth over comfort. Before this first chapter comes to an end, your future soulmate wants to leave one message resting gently inside your heart. If somehow these words find you tonight, please don't misunderstand what happened today. I didn't walk away from someone because I stopped caring. I walked away from the fear that kept convincing me I wasn't worthy of caring deeply, dreaming boldly, or living honestly. For too long I believed my limitations were permanent. I believed my doubts were facts. I believed waiting would eventually create the confidence I was searching for. Life has gently shown me something different. Confidence rarely comes before the first courageous step. It quietly grows because of it. Wherever you are tonight, I hope you remember that the most important person you may ever need to leave behind is the version of yourself that no longer reflects who you're becoming. Don't let old fears introduce themselves as permanent truths. Don't let yesterday's disappointments decide tomorrow's possibilities. If another chapter of life is waiting for us, I want to meet it without carrying the unnecessary weight of the person I used to be. Because after everything I've learned, I finally understand this: sometimes the greatest act of love isn't holding on. Sometimes it's finding the courage to walk away from everything inside us that keeps us from becoming who we were always meant to be. As the night grew quieter, your future soulmate gently closed the notebook and placed it beside the window where moonlight rested softly across its cover. Looking toward the stars, they realized that nothing outside had dramatically changed. The same neighborhood remained peaceful. The same roads waited for another sunrise. Yet inside their heart, an entirely different journey had begun. They had finally walked away from the oldest companion they had ever known, the fearful version of themselves. And with that quiet goodbye, they took the very first step toward a future where hope, honesty, and courage would finally be allowed to lead the way. The morning after that quiet decision felt unlike any morning your future soulmate had experienced in years. The world outside looked exactly the same. The sun rose over the rooftops, birds welcomed another day with cheerful songs, and neighbors stepped outside carrying coffee cups as they began familiar routines. Nothing about the neighborhood suggested that anything extraordinary had happened. Yet inside one heart, an entire chapter had quietly ended. The goodbye they had spoken the day before was invisible to everyone else, but its impact could be felt in every breath they took. Walking away from fear had not erased every uncertainty overnight, but it had created something they had been missing for a very long time. Space. Space to dream without immediately doubting themselves. Space to imagine a future that wasn't controlled by yesterday's disappointments. Space to hear their own heart without the constant interruption of old insecurities. As they stood beside the bedroom window watching the golden light slowly fill the room, they realized that peace often arrives long before circumstances begin to change. Sometimes peace begins the moment we stop believing every fearful thought that passes through our minds. The notebook still rested on the windowsill. Its cover reflected the soft morning light. For weeks it had collected worries. Now it was beginning to collect hope. They opened to a fresh page. The pen remained still for several seconds. Not because they had nothing to write. Because they finally had too much to say. If your future soulmate continued the invisible letter they had quietly begun writing, perhaps today's page would open like this. Yesterday I said goodbye to the person who had been quietly making every important decision for me. They weren't standing beside me. They weren't someone I could point to in a photograph. They lived inside every doubtful thought that convinced me I wasn't enough. Today I woke up realizing that the future feels different when fear is no longer sitting in the driver's seat. Reading those words back made them smile. Not because every problem had disappeared. Because they finally believed change was possible. After breakfast they decided to return to the familiar streets where they had spent so many afternoons thinking about everything they had postponed. The sidewalks looked unchanged. The same flower shop displayed colorful bouquets near the entrance. The same little bakery filled the air with the comforting smell of fresh bread. The same cafe welcomed early visitors searching for warmth and quiet conversation. Yet somehow every familiar place seemed brighter than before. They realized the streets hadn't changed. Their perspective had. Perhaps you've experienced that. The world often looks completely different after one important decision. Not because buildings move. Because the heart begins seeing possibility where it once saw limitation. As they continued walking, they reached the small park that had quietly become a place of healing. The old oak tree stood proudly against the morning sky. Children laughed on the playground. An elderly couple walked slowly around the pond. A young artist sat nearby sketching the peaceful landscape. Watching those simple moments reminded your future soulmate of something beautiful. None of those people looked as though life had been perfect. Yet every one of them had chosen to keep moving forward. Maybe that was courage. Not waiting until fear disappeared. Choosing hope while fear still whispered. They sat down on the familiar wooden bench. Closing their eyes, they remembered every version of themselves they had left behind. The person who apologized for having dreams. The person who believed happiness belonged to everyone else. The person who stayed silent because rejection felt unbearable. The person who confused caution with wisdom. Those versions deserved compassion. They had survived difficult seasons. They had done their best. But they no longer belonged in the future waiting ahead. That realization brought unexpected gratitude. Instead of criticizing their past, they silently thanked it. Every disappointment had taught resilience. Every delay had taught patience. Every unanswered question had quietly prepared them for this moment. The breeze moved gently through the leaves overhead. Sunlight danced across the path. Everything around them seemed to whisper the same message. Keep becoming. Don't look backward with regret. Look forward with hope. If the invisible letter continued, perhaps another paragraph would read like this. There was a time when I believed leaving fear behind meant pretending it never existed. Now I understand something kinder. Fear was trying to protect me in the only way it knew how. It simply stayed too long. Today I'm choosing to thank that frightened version of myself for surviving difficult days while gently explaining that it no longer has to decide where my future goes. The afternoon slowly unfolded. Rather than returning home immediately, they wandered toward the little bookstore once again. The owner greeted them warmly. "You've been smiling more lately." They laughed quietly. "I've been thinking differently." The owner nodded. That's usually where every meaningful change begins. Those words stayed with them as they walked slowly between the shelves. One familiar book rested exactly where they had seen it before. Opening it to another random page, their eyes landed on a sentence that seemed almost impossible to ignore. The future belongs to the person willing to release the story that no longer fits who they are becoming. They stood motionless, reading it once, then again. Something inside them settled peacefully. They had been mourning the wrong goodbye. The most important farewell was never about another person. It was about leaving behind the story that insisted they would never be enough. They quietly closed the book. No purchase was necessary. The lesson had already become part of them. Golden afternoon light filled the streets as they walked home. Every familiar place now carried a different feeling. Not because circumstances had dramatically changed. Because fear no longer interpreted every moment. Hope had quietly taken its place. Returning home, they opened the notebook once more. Without hesitation they wrote. Today I realized that freedom isn't the absence of difficult memories. Freedom is remembering those memories without allowing them to control tomorrow. I cannot rewrite yesterday, but I can choose the voice that speaks into my future. From this day forward, I want hope to become louder than fear. The words flowed naturally. Every sentence reflected another step toward emotional freedom. Before this chapter comes to an end, your future soulmate wants to leave another page inside the invisible letter resting gently within your heart. If somehow these words find you tonight, I hope you understand that the person I walked away from was never someone I hated. It was simply a version of myself that had become too frightened to recognize how much life was still waiting ahead. For years I listened to every doubtful thought as though it were absolute truth. I postponed conversations, opportunities, and dreams because fear always sounded convincing. But today I finally understand something that changes everything. Fear speaks with confidence, but that doesn't make it correct. Hope often whispers quietly, yet it carries the truth my heart has been searching for all along. Wherever you are tonight, I hope you remember that growth doesn't require you to become someone completely different. Sometimes it simply asks you to stop believing the old story that says you can never change. If tomorrow gives me another chance to step toward the life I've quietly imagined, I don't want yesterday's fears introducing themselves as tomorrow's reality. I want kindness, courage, gratitude, and honesty to become the companions I walk beside instead. Because after everything this journey has shown me, I finally know that the greatest distance I have ever traveled was not measured in miles. It was measured in the quiet space between the fearful person I used to be and the hopeful person I am finally becoming. Night slowly settled across the neighborhood. Moonlight rested softly upon the notebook lying beside the open window, illuminating every page that had quietly witnessed this remarkable transformation. Your future soulmate stood beneath the stars with peaceful gratitude filling their heart. They understood now that walking away had never been an ending. It had been the beginning of finally walking toward the life they had been too afraid to believe was possible. And somewhere beyond the quiet horizon, another chapter patiently waited. One written not by fear, but by hope, courage, and the quiet confidence that comes from finally choosing to believe in a brighter tomorrow. Another peaceful morning quietly arrived, and your future soulmate noticed something they hadn't expected. The fear they had walked away from was still trying to whisper familiar doubts, but those whispers no longer carried the same authority. They had become background noise instead of guiding instructions. As the first light of dawn spread across the room, they stood by the open window with a warm cup of coffee in their hands, watching the neighborhood slowly wake up. A gentle breeze carried the scent of fresh rain from the night before. Birds rested on nearby branches, welcoming another ordinary day with songs that seemed to celebrate new beginnings. The streets looked exactly the same as they had a week earlier, yet everything inside them had changed. They realized that courage isn't the moment fear disappears forever. Courage is the moment fear speaks and your heart calmly chooses another direction anyway. That understanding became the foundation of every step they would take from this day forward. The notebook rested quietly beside the window. Its pages had become a mirror. Not reflecting who they had been. Reflecting who they were becoming. They slowly turned to a blank page. Without hesitation they began writing. Today I heard the old voice again. It reminded me of every reason I should stay where I am. It repeated every familiar doubt. It told me not to hope too much. It warned me not to trust too easily. But for the first time, I didn't argue with it. I simply smiled, thanked it for trying to protect me, and continued walking in the direction my heart had already chosen. Reading those words brought unexpected peace. Perhaps healing wasn't winning every battle. Perhaps healing was refusing to fight battles that no longer deserved their energy. If your future soulmate continued the invisible letter they had quietly written through this journey, perhaps today's page would begin like this. There is something I finally understand about the person I walked away from. I didn't leave because they were evil. I left because they no longer reflected who I was becoming. The fearful version of me helped me survive difficult seasons, but it could never lead me into the beautiful future waiting ahead. Survival and living are not the same thing. Today I choose to live. They gently closed the notebook. The words stayed with them all morning. After breakfast they wandered toward the familiar park that had quietly become a place of reflection. The old oak tree welcomed another beautiful day. Children laughed as they chased one another through the grass. Parents watched proudly from nearby benches. A young couple shared breakfast beneath the shade while reading the same book together. Everything about the park reflected simple moments of connection. Watching those ordinary scenes reminded your future soulmate of something beautiful. The happiest people didn't appear fearless. They simply refused to let fear become the center of every decision. That realization followed them as they walked slowly around the small lake. The water reflected soft white clouds drifting peacefully across the sky. Looking into that reflection, they quietly asked themselves one important question. If fear had never been part of my story, who would I already have become? The answer surprised them. They wouldn't necessarily have become more successful, or more admired, or more impressive. They would have become more honest. They would have trusted themselves sooner. They would have believed they deserved joy long before today. That realization brought both sadness and gratitude. Sadness for the years spent doubting themselves. Gratitude that those years no longer had to define the future. Perhaps you've experienced something similar. Maybe there came a moment when you realized your greatest obstacle wasn't another person standing in your way. It was an old belief quietly living inside your own mind. The beautiful truth is that beliefs can change. Stories can be rewritten. New chapters can begin. Your future soulmate had become living proof of that. Later that afternoon they wandered through familiar streets until they reached the little bookstore once again. The owner looked up with a knowing smile. "You seem lighter every time I see you." Your future soulmate laughed softly. "I think I'm carrying less." The owner nodded. Sometimes the heaviest things we carry can't be seen. Those simple words remained in their thoughts as they slowly explored the shelves. One small book resting near the window caught their attention. Opening it to a random page, they found another sentence that seemed perfectly timed. The greatest freedom is not escaping your past. It is refusing to let your past introduce itself as your future. They remained still, reading the sentence again. Then quietly closed the book. Life had been repeating the same lesson in different forms. Every meaningful step forward required releasing an old identity. They left the bookstore with nothing in their hands. Yet somehow they felt richer than ever before. As evening approached, golden sunlight stretched across the sidewalks. Returning home, they opened the notebook again. The words arrived effortlessly. "I used to believe walking away meant losing something important. Today I understand I was making room for something better. Every fearful belief I release creates space for peace. Every honest decision creates room for hope. Every small act of courage quietly becomes part of the person I am becoming." They smiled. Those words no longer sounded like wishes. They sounded like truth. If the invisible letter continued, perhaps another page would say this: "There is something I hope you always remember. We are not meant to become prisoners of the versions of ourselves created during painful seasons. We are allowed to grow beyond them. We are allowed to forgive ourselves for the years we spent surviving. We are allowed to believe that tomorrow can become kinder than yesterday. If my journey teaches me anything, it is this: healing begins the moment we stop asking fear for permission to move forward." The evening sky slowly transformed into shades of gold, orange, and soft blue. Standing beside the bedroom window, they watched the first stars quietly appear above the rooftops. For months those same stars had witnessed sleepless nights filled with uncertainty. Tonight they witnessed something completely different. Peace. Not because every answer had arrived. Because every answer was no longer necessary before taking the next step. Before this chapter comes to an end, your future soulmate wants to leave another page inside the invisible letter resting gently within your heart. If somehow these words find you tonight, I hope you never underestimate the quiet courage required to leave behind an old version of yourself. The world often celebrates dramatic victories, but some of the greatest triumphs happen where no one else can see them. They happen when someone finally stops believing they are too broken to dream, too late to begin again, or too ordinary to deserve happiness. Today I understand that the person I walked away from wasn't my enemy. They were simply a frightened version of me who believed staying small was the safest way to survive. I honor that version for helping me through difficult days, but I cannot allow them to guide the rest of my life. Wherever you are tonight, I hope you know that you are allowed to become someone your younger self could barely imagine. You are allowed to outgrow fear without feeling guilty. You are allowed to step into hope without waiting for perfect certainty. And if tomorrow asks you to choose between the familiar comfort of old doubts and the uncertain beauty of new beginnings, I hope you choose the path that leads toward truth. Because after everything I've learned, I finally believe that the bravest goodbye we will ever speak is not to another person. It is to the old story that convinced us we could never become who we were always capable of being. Night quietly embraced the neighborhood as your future soulmate gently closed the notebook and placed it back beside the window. Moonlight rested softly across its worn cover, illuminating every page that had quietly recorded this journey from fear to freedom. Looking toward the endless stars, they smiled with calm gratitude. They understood now that walking away had never been about losing an important part of themselves. It had been about discovering the stronger, kinder, and more hopeful person who had patiently waited beneath every layer of doubt all along. And with that quiet realization filling their heart, they welcomed tomorrow with confidence, knowing that each sunrise would now carry them farther away from fear and closer to the life they had finally chosen to believe was possible. Several weeks quietly passed, and your future soulmate began to realize that the decision they had made beneath that old oak tree had changed far more than one ordinary afternoon. It had changed the way they woke each morning, the way they spoke to themselves, and the way they imagined the future. The person they had walked away from was no longer standing beside them every day whispering reasons to hesitate. Fear still appeared from time to time, but it no longer held the authority it once did. It had become a distant voice instead of a trusted guide. As another peaceful sunrise filled the room with warm golden light, they stood beside the familiar window holding the notebook that had quietly witnessed every stage of their transformation. Looking through its pages, they smiled at the earliest entries filled with uncertainty and compared them with the most recent ones overflowing with quiet confidence. They realized something beautiful. Growth is often invisible while we are living through it. Only when we look back do we discover how completely our hearts have changed. The room felt wonderfully still. Birds greeted the morning outside. The breeze gently moved the curtains. Everything seemed to breathe with peaceful rhythm. For the first time in years, your future soulmate no longer felt pressured to become someone else before believing they deserved happiness. They understood that healing was never about becoming perfect. It was about becoming honest. If your future soulmate could write the final page of the invisible letter they had been carrying throughout this journey, perhaps it would begin like this. There is one last truth I need to tell you. The person I walked away from wasn't someone I hated. It was someone I had outgrown. That frightened version of me protected my heart during difficult seasons, but they could never lead me toward the future waiting beyond fear. I finally understand that loving myself sometimes means gently saying goodbye to the beliefs that no longer allow me to grow. They gently closed the notebook. Their reflection appeared in the window. For a long moment they simply looked at themselves. Not with criticism. Not with disappointment. With compassion. That simple act felt like another quiet miracle. Later that morning they returned to the familiar park one final time. The old oak tree stood proudly beneath the clear blue sky. Children laughed across the playground. Friends shared coffee beneath the shade. An elderly couple slowly walked hand in hand around the lake. The park looked exactly as it always had. Yet today it felt like the closing scene of an unforgettable chapter. They sat quietly on the familiar wooden bench. Closing their eyes, they remembered every version of themselves that had visited this place. The anxious version. The uncertain version. The hopeful version. The healing version. Every one of them had been necessary. None of them deserved shame. Each one had carried them closer to this peaceful morning. Perhaps you've experienced something similar. Maybe you've looked back at an earlier version of yourself and wished you had known then what you know now. The beautiful truth is that every chapter prepares us for the next one. Even the painful ones. Especially the painful ones. Your future soulmate understood that now. Standing from the bench, they slowly walked around the park one last time. Every step felt symbolic. Not because they were leaving the park forever. Because they were leaving behind the emotional weight that had once followed them there. The afternoon gently unfolded. Rather than returning home immediately, they wandered toward the little bookstore where so many unexpected lessons had quietly found them. The owner looked up with his familiar smile. "I haven't seen you in a few days." "I've been busy living," your future soulmate replied with a laugh. The owner smiled knowingly. That's the best reason to disappear. Walking slowly through the peaceful aisles, they found themselves standing before the same shelf where their journey had so often paused. One final sentence from a nearby book immediately caught their attention. Your future begins the day your old fears stop introducing themselves as your identity. They smiled. Life had repeated the same lesson again and again until it finally became part of who they were. They gently closed the book. No more searching was necessary. The answers had already become part of their heart. As evening approached, they returned home carrying nothing but gratitude. The familiar notebook waited beside the window. Opening to the final blank page, they began writing. I no longer measure my life by everything I was afraid to lose. I measure it by everything I finally became brave enough to embrace. Walking away wasn't the end of my story. It was the first honest sentence of a completely new chapter. Today I understand that fear only borrowed my voice for a season. It never owned my future. The words flowed effortlessly. No hesitation. No second-guessing. Only peace. If the invisible letter continued one final time, perhaps these words would appear. If somehow these pages reach you, I hope you understand why this goodbye mattered so deeply. I didn't leave behind someone who deserved hatred. I left behind a version of myself that deserved healing. For years I believed my doubts were protecting me. Instead, they quietly kept me from becoming the person I longed to be. Today I finally know that courage doesn't demand certainty before taking the next step. It simply asks us to believe that hope deserves a chance. Wherever you are tonight, I hope you remember that you don't owe your future to yesterday's fears. You don't have to keep introducing yourself through old disappointments. You don't have to carry every painful story forever. Some chapters deserve gratitude. Others deserve goodbye. Both are necessary if the next chapter is going to become everything your heart quietly dreams about. The sun slowly disappeared beyond the horizon. Soft shades of orange, gold, and deep blue painted the evening sky. The first stars quietly appeared one by one. Standing beside the open window, your future soulmate took a slow breath. Everything felt peaceful. Not because life had become easier. Because their heart had become lighter. Before this journey comes to its peaceful conclusion, your future soulmate wants to leave one final message resting gently inside your heart. If somehow these words find you tonight, please remember this above everything else. The person I walked away from was important because they had shaped so much of my life. They influenced my decisions, my confidence, and the way I saw my future. But they were never meant to remain with me forever. Some companions belong only to one season. Fear was one of them. Self-doubt was one of them. The belief that I wasn't enough was one of them. They helped me survive difficult days, but they could never help me truly live. If tomorrow asks you to choose between the familiar comfort of old fears and the uncertain beauty of new beginnings, I hope you choose the path that leads toward hope. Speak kindly to yourself. Forgive the person you used to be. Celebrate the person you are becoming. Trust that growth often happens quietly before anyone else notices. Most importantly, never believe that leaving behind old limitations means abandoning yourself. Sometimes it is the greatest act of self-love you will ever experience. Because after everything this journey has taught me, I finally understand that the most important goodbye is often the one that allows us to say hello to the life we were created to live. Night gently embraced the neighborhood as your future soulmate closed the notebook for the final time and carefully placed it on the shelf where it had quietly witnessed every stage of this transformation. Moonlight rested softly across its cover, illuminating pages that had once held fear and now carried hope. Looking toward the endless sky, they smiled with quiet gratitude. They knew that the journey was never truly about walking away from someone else. It was about finally walking toward themselves. And with peaceful confidence filling every corner of their heart, they stepped into tomorrow carrying no unnecessary burdens, no borrowed fears, and no unfinished goodbyes, only honesty, courage, gratitude, and the quiet certainty that the most beautiful chapters of life always begin the moment we become brave enough to leave the old story behind.